Hi, I'm Ashura, and today I'm going to talk about the complete and very detailed history of the Arathi. From the unification of Arathor and the Troll Wars, through the founding of Stormwind to the Second War, and the Hallowfall expedition. I'm going to break down everything we know about the Eastern Kingdom's Arathi, and how that connects back to the Arathi that we've met in The War Within in Hallowfall. I also want to talk a little bit about some speculations and theories I have regarding how these two groups overlap, and maybe get a little bit unhinged in talking about some completely not canon things, because I also do want to throw in a little bit about movie canon, simply because I've seen a lot of people bring it up, and I want to clear up some confusions in that regard. But the bulk of this is going to be about Arathi history. Now, before I jump into that, I want to give a little bit of a disclaimer because this is sort of confusing. So the term Arathi actually means three distinct things in lore. It refers to the Arathi race, the group of people that we meet in Hallowfall. It refers to the Arathi bloodline, which is the lineage that comes from King Thoradin, essentially the royal Arathor bloodline. And it also refers to the Arathi tribe, and this will make a bit more sense when we get into the history in just a little bit, but that essentially is just early humanity. And I wanted to point this out because I think it's a little bit confusing if you only know about the Arathi in Hallowfall, and then suddenly learn the Arathi settled Gilneas. It's like, what? It's just that this term is used sort of interchangeably, and I am also going to do that in this video. So, starting with the unification of Arathor 2,800 years ago. At this point, humanity was broken up into different tribes. We had the Alterac tribe, a Tirisfal Glades tribe, and the Arathi tribe, plus many others that we don't really know the name of at this point. At around the same time, the High Elves were moving into and had settled Quel'Thalas as their new home, since they originally came from Kalimdor. Unfortunately for them, Quel'Thalas also happened to be the indigenous native land of the Trolls, and the Trolls did not take very kindly to the High Elves moving in on their territory. So the High Elves and the Trolls started engaging in battles and skirmishes, some of which sort of pushed the Trolls south so that they started invading human territory and getting involved in fights with the different human tribes. The leader of the Arathi tribe, a man named Warlord Thoradin, realized that if the Trolls were to engage in full-out war with the humans, they would not stand a chance unless they united. The Trolls would easily overcome the disparate human tribes. And so Thoradin took it upon himself to unite all of the tribes of humanity under one banner, the Kingdom of Arathor. And he did this in 6 years, through political marriages, through duels, even through appealing to some of their religious practices. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but most of this is in the Stromkar artifact book, though I did do a narration of that, so if you're actually interested in the finer details, I will put a link to that in the cards. So just as Thoradin realizes that the humans could not have stood divided against the Trolls, so too does King Anastarion of the High Elves realize they're not going to win this war. Tensions have boiled enough that the High Elves and the Trolls are now in full-out battle with each other. And so King Anastarion turns to the humans for help. He sends envoys to Thoradin to ask for his assistance in fighting this war. And Thoradin realizes they can't do this on physical might alone. They need the magical abilities of the High Elves in order to make a real difference in this war. So he strikes a deal with Anastarion. If the High Elves teach 100 humans in the ways of arcane magic, they will fight this war alongside them. And so they do. There are many battles that are fought, but these 100 human mages gather at the foot of the Alterac Mountains, pool their power together, and unleash a devastating fellstorm upon the trolls, pretty much almost completely wiping them out and effectively winning the war right then and there. For helping them win the war, King Anastarian now owes a debt to Thoradin, or one of his descendants, that they can make good on at any time to request the High Elves' aid. As a little small fun fact, we actually know who one of the 100 is. It's Merrill Fellstorm, who we saw as recently as early Dorn questing after Dalaran crashed and burned, but he shows up most prominently in the Legion Order Hall class campaign for mages, and most of his story comes from either the Legend comics or the comic, the WoW comic, which is what we learn that he's not only over 3,000 years old, but in which we learn, as Egwin tells us, that he was actually one of the original 100, and he ended up suffering a mortal wound during the Troll Wars and basically turned himself into an undead to survive, which is why he's still alive after all this time. So he's not actually one of the Scourge undead, but he is undead. So, about 100 years later, after the Troll Wars, happens the expansion of Arathor. Arathor starts expanding its borders and establishing the human kingdoms as we know them today, such as Dalaran, Alterac, Gilneas, and a little bit later Kultiris. Stormwind and Lordaeron would actually come much later, like a little over 1,000 years later. And so this creates an empire, the capital of which is Strom in the Arathi Highlands, which is led by Thoradin's descendants. So let's fast forward to 1,200 years ago. At this point, Arathor has expanded, and all of the human kingdoms have started to become almost completely self-sufficient, autonomous city-states. They don't really rely on Strom as much as they used to, which means the influence of Strom as their capital is largely waning. Part of this is actually for economic reasons. Strom was built in the Arathi Highlands, and it is not a place that has good natural resources or is really in a good position at all. But cities like Gilneas and Kultiris were able to flourish, partially because of their access to natural resources, and basically very quickly outpaced Strom over the course of a little over 1,000 years. This essentially results in the dissolution of Arathor, where it is no longer connected human kingdoms operating under one banner, but completely separate nations. Things go three ways. Many of Strom's noble families depart from Strom and actually settle in Tirisfal Glades, founding Lordaeron, which incidentally later would become the capital city of the Alliance. Some noble families stayed in Strom and actually claimed it for themselves. Strom was taken over by the Trollbanes and renamed to Stromgarde, just becoming its own human kingdom among the seven. And lastly, Thoradin's descendants went south in search of lusher land and founded Stormwind. There's a little subzone in Arathi Highlands called Faldor's Cove, named for Faldor, one of Thoradin's descendants, who chartered a ship and went south to establish Stormwind. It's a little bit interesting to me that Faldor, one of Thoradin's descendants, established Stormwind City, and yet the Rins are the ones on Stormwind's throne. We don't actually really know why or what happened in that regard, but we do know that by the time of the Second War, just a few years after the Dark Portal opened, and about a little over 1,000 years after this event, that the last of Thoradin's descendants was a man named Anduin Lothar. Just a knight of Stormwind City, though he was good friends with the royal family. So during the First War, the Orcish horde invaded Azeroth and razed Stormwind, burning it to the ground. They moved north in events that would become known as the Second War shortly after that, and started heading for Lordaeron City. They also teamed up with the trolls, who were really eager for revenge after losing in the Troll Wars all those hundreds of years ago. Now, by this point, the High Elves had basically fallen out completely with the humans. They were very isolationist and had no interest in being involved in their dealings at all. And the human kingdoms each had also sort of become isolationist. They had grown autonomous after the dissolution of Arathor and had no real desire to unify and potentially give up that power again. And so, just as in the Troll Wars, ironically, it became very clear that humanity could not stand divided against the orcs and the trolls and their forces. So it took one man, Anduin Lothar, to call in on that debt that King Anastarion of the High Elves owed to his bloodline from over 1,000 years ago and force the High Elves' hand to join in the war and help them fight the orcs. Granted, it probably also helped that the orcs decided to go north to quell the loss and start burning it down, but this was actually a really instrumental part of the Second War. And there's a pretty cool scene in Tides of Darkness where Teredos Menethil, the leader of Lordaeron, basically announces Anduin Lothar is the last of the Arathi, the last of Thoradin's descendants. And everyone sort of has a brief freak out where they're like, "Are you coming to claim kingship of us all?" And he's like, "No, I just want to win this war." As we know, they would eventually win the Second War, but Anduin Lothar would fall in battle during it, the last of his line. Or so we thought, until the war within and we got here and we met Faerin Lothar and the rest of the Arathi, where the Empire of Arathor basically dissolved on the Eastern Kingdoms and became a series of autonomous city-states, the 7 human kingdoms. It apparently had continued to flourish and thrive on some other continent in the ocean, and now we're meeting an expedition that has come from that kingdom that still exists. Now, I want to set up a little bit of context for the Hallowfall expedition at first, because this has been a point of confusion for people, and I think it's mostly because we don't really learn this in-game. Most of this information came from BlizzCon or like website blurbs, and I think was also partially changed in the process. So at some point in the past, though we don't know exactly when, a group of Arathi and High Elves decided to leave to go across the ocean and found their own kingdom. Now, we don't know the name of this kingdom at this point in time. Many people have speculated that it's Avaloran, an island alluded to in the Uldaman lore books, but one of the Arathi lore books makes reference to a, quote, Titan Isle, which implies to me that they're distinct, but entirely open to interpretation. For now, I'm just going to refer to it as the Arathi Continent. So a group of Arathi and High Elves settle this Arathi Continent and live there for however many hundreds, thousands of years, until the last couple decades, when at the behest of their emperor, after he has a vision, they form the Hallowfall expedition from their military and send it off in search of Renalash and Beladar. And they end up getting transported to this underground cavern underneath Beladar. In early alpha quests, 2 different quests referred to this as happening both 10 years and 15 years ago. In the main campaign, Faerin said that it had been 10 years, whereas if you talked to the last surviving mage in one of the smaller local stories, he said that it had been 15 years. When these quests made it to live, this was changed to actually just be a lot more vague. The numbers were removed entirely, and it was instead simply stated that it had been over a decade ago. Technically speaking, we do know it has been at least 10 years since the Arathi arrived, not just because he says it's been over a decade, but because the Arathi were here when Sargeras plunged his sword into Azeroth during Legion, and by in-game timeline terms, Legion was pretty much almost exactly 10 years ago. The only thing is, we don't know how much earlier before that they arrived. If they'd been in Hallowfall for years, or if it had been a more recent arrival. We do know that Faerin was a kid when she absconded to Hallowfall, and now she is presumably a young woman, which I would say indicate that it has been at least a decade, but doesn't really give us a specific time frame to go off of. But I think that we can assertively say it's been some time between a decade or two that the Hallowfall expedition has existed here. Many people thought that it had been longer, or that Faerin Lothar was more directly related to Anduin Lothar. That's not the case, and I wanted to point that out. So the big question is, when did this group of Arathi and High Elves leave to found their own kingdom on this Arathi continent? Most people think it was when Arathor dissolved that they simply decided to up and leave when the Empire fell apart to continue their own somewhere across the ocean. But I don't think this is the case. I think it actually happened pretty much immediately after the Troll Wars, like 2,700 years ago. And I'm gonna break down why. First of all, I think it just makes the most sense. Arathor had expanded in the years following the Troll Wars and founded several other human kingdoms. I think it logically follows that a group of Arathi, along with some High Elves, would also decide to leave and found their own kingdom. It's pretty much the same exact thing that happened elsewhere. But the main reason that I think this happened after the Troll Wars has to do with one NPC's dialogue. An NPC right at the start of Hallowfall, and I'm going to read that out for you real quick, because I want to unpack it all.
You are an outsider, yes?
We thought we were sailing towards a glorious fight to secure the Emperor's vision. We were to bring back a victory for the Empire. The last thing I ever expected was to have to create a life here. Ask if she is an elf. Why would you... the ears. Legend says that when the Arathi first settled at our home, we were two peoples, humans and the High Elves who joined them to help teach magic. They built the foundations of the Arathi Empire together and became one. We have remained united ever since. I am not an elf. I am an Arathi. And I want to point out the part here that says, the High Elves who joined them to help teach magic. Now we know that the humans didn't have any access to magic of their own until the High Elves helped teach them. But after the Troll Wars, they founded Dalaran, and it actually says in Chronicle that the number of human spellcasters within Arathor increased dramatically after the Troll Wars. So if this group of humans had left like 100, 200, however many hundreds of years later after the Troll Wars, why would they need High Elves to go with them? Couldn't they just have had more humans who were skilled in the arcane arts go with them? And that's not to say that they didn't, but in my opinion, that specific phrasing, considering that we know the High Elves taught humans magic in the first place, implies to me that this was actually much closer to the Troll Wars rather than later. It's also worth pointing out that this was the time in history when the High Elves and the humans were the closest. We know that by the time of the Second War, King Anastarian didn't really have any love for the humans. His hand had to be forced for him and the High Elves to join the war. And even when they did join the alliance, they were the first ones to leave it pretty shortly after. We actually know that there were half-elves pretty soon after the Troll Wars. I think one of the oldest half-elves we know of is Aladai, the first guardian of Tirisfal, but he lived around 2,600 years ago, which was like 200 years after the Troll Wars, so relations between the High Elves and humans were good enough, so to speak, that there were half-elves. I also think it happened closer to 2,700 years ago because ultimately it had to be long enough for the humans and the High Elves to reproduce to a point that they became the Arathi. This doesn't necessarily say that there aren't any High Elves left, But to me, this sort of reads like it's saying that there aren't any high elves left, at least not enough for them to distinguish themselves as elves. That through the generations, the high elves and humans reproduced enough that there's simply only Arathi left. And I don't think that would make as much sense if there were still high elves alive. Now, look, high elves are pretty long lived, and I do want to get into that. But I think, just logically speaking, that for them to have sort of died out, it makes more sense because of their lifespans that it would have been longer ago rather than closer to the dissolution of Arathor. We're talking a difference between did they leave 2,700 years ago or did they leave 1,200 years ago or potentially any time in between. Let's sort of contextualize this in terms of lifespans. Now, starting with half-elf lifespans, we don't actually know how long they are. And that's mostly because every reputable half-elf in WoW lore is at this point a child, or in their 20s, which doesn't really tell us much about their full lifespans. Now, I did just bring up Aladai, who was alive 2,600 years ago, and we don't know exactly how long he lived, but it does tell us in the lore that he used magic to artificially extend his lifespan by 100 years. And, okay, maybe this is a little bit of a reach, but if he would have naturally lived more than 100 years or hundreds of years, would he have needed to extend his lifespan? The only maybe counter-argument to that is that he served as the first guardian of Tirisfal, and that century that he extended his lifespan by was basically his sort of service to the Guardians of Tirisfal, and every subsequent Guardian of Tirisfal also served like 100-year service. So it could be that maybe he just extended his lifespan for that reason, and not because he really needed to. But I'm going to choose to personally interpret it as half-elves just having more human-leaning lifespans, which I think, given what we know about Hallowfall and the Arathi, makes a little bit more sense. So let's jump into high-elf lifespans. Because more than telling us anything about the Arathi, there is sort of a question, could there be high-elves on the Arathi Continent still? High-elf lifespans are sort of a hot mess. Like, of things in WoW lore that are self-contradictory and frequently retconned, this is probably one of the biggest offenders, and it's a disaster. So, to set the baseline, Illyria's 1,000 Years of War audio drama says that the Sunwell gave the High Elves something akin to immortality. So, like the Night Elves with the World Tree, they were immortal and couldn't die of old age. The old WoW encyclopedia, which was on the website, but you can't access it anymore except just through like the Warcraft wiki, says that High Elf lifespans could extend as long as 3,000 years without the influence of the Sunwell. Now, if 3,000 years is their natural non-immortal lifespan, and it's only been 2,800 years since the Troll Wars, surely there would be some High Elves alive on the Arathi Continent, right? But let's break this down a little bit more. So, starting with King Anasterion. Both Blood of the Highborn and the Arthas book say that he was considered elderly at 3,000 years of age. The only thing is that he didn't die of old age, he was killed by Arthas, so we don't really know how long he could have lived, just that he was pretty old by the time he made it to 3,000. Then there's Illyria. The old WoW encyclopedia says that she served in the Troll Wars, which combined with the 1,000 years she spends in the Nether during her audio drama story would make her over 4,000 years old, but her involvement in the Troll Wars has actually since been retconned, most ostensibly by the Sylvanas book. And we learn from the Hunter Artifact class lore that the Windrunner who was actually involved in the Troll Wars was a guy named Talinus. May also be worth pointing out that Illyria is named for her maternal grandmother. So in a really funny way, maybe it was just her grandmother that was in the Troll Wars, not her. And our last example is Lorash, a guy who's mostly involved with the BFA novellas, and in one of them he claims that he was born in Tirisfal Glades before the High Elves established Quel'Thalas, roughly between 6800 and 7300 years ago. What's more is that he says his mother was raised by the Lich King and made into an undead, which means she too had to have been around 7,000 years old. This is mostly consistent with the lore that the Sunwell made them immortal, but contradicts the idea that Anasterion was old at 3,000 years. And I don't think we've met another High Elf that has, in any sense, been nearly as long-lived. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this lore. The Lorash part, it's sort of a hot mess, and I don't love the idea that High Elves can actually live to be 7,000 plus years old. I'm going to choose to personally ignore it and pretend that it does not exist. But considering when it comes to what we know about the Arathi and Hallowfall, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, if High Elves could live to 7,000 plus years, I mean, first of all, surely there would be some on the Arathi Continent, but also secondly, like I said before, how would the Arathi and the High Elves have repopulated together enough that there would be no High Elves left? Surely there would still be High Elves, even if elderly. Part of the reason I want to bring this up, more than just sort of funny speculation thinking about what the Arathi Continent will look like than anything, is because there's only 2 NPCs in Hallowfall that use the High Elf model as opposed to just a human model with the elf ears. One of them is the mage, who I think is actually young and unfortunately gets killed in the quests. But the other one is Great Chiron, and someone had brought it up to me, which is what prompted me to want to talk about this. And they had asked, is Chiron supposed to be a High Elf? And I didn't think so, because they never make any reference to being High Elf. I would assume that, say, if I came here on a Blood Elf and played through this, that if Chiron were originally from Quel'Thalas, they would have recognized me, right? Or said something to that effect. Though it could be that simply culturally speaking, they now no longer recognize themselves as High Elves. They are all Arathi, no matter their lineage. But I think my opinion on this front is that they don't use a High Elf model for any significant lore reason. I think it's actually because that they are a prominent NPC in the Hallowfall campaign, and depicting them as a High Elf is simply a sort of quick shortcut to establishing that, especially since everyone else is just using human models. Okay, so now that we've established a bit about the history of the Arathi, this brings us to another question people have asked. How exactly are Anduin Lothar and Faerin Lothar related? And the answer is pretty distantly, to the point that it's probably negligible and they're, like, hardly actually blood related at all. I assume that their common ancestor is Thoradin, and that it was one of Thoradin's kids or grandkids who left to establish this Arathi Empire. But it's possible that if the humans of the Arathi and the High Elves actually left later, their shared ancestor could be a little bit further down. And I also brought up half-elf lifespans because it's unclear how many generations have passed between Thoradin and Faerin compared to between Thoradin and Anduin Lothar. TLDR, they're not like siblings. It's not a parent and daughter. They're like on completely different branches of the family tree at this point. It is interesting to me, though, that Faerin acknowledges to Anduin Frin, not to be confused with Anduin Lothar, that she does come from noble origins, but I am very curious, though, how Faerin's lineage ties into the Emperor. I'm assuming that because one of Thoradin's descendants probably was the one to establish this Arathi Empire, that she's in some way related to the Emperor, but it's not really clear how. We do know that there is a Duke Lothar. One of the Arathi lore books, the Idiom one, talks about a Duke Lothar annexing one of the islands, and I sort of erroneously assumed that this was her father for a while, and then I realized we're not actually given any timeline on it. So it could be her father, grandfather, someone a little bit further back in the timeline. We don't even know if she is one of Thoradin's direct descendants, in the same way that Anduin Lothar was the last of Thoradin's direct descendants, at least on the Eastern Kingdom side. Though we do know just a little bit about the Arathi ruling dynasty. Not much. The same lore books also make reference to an Emperor Lanes IV, and the big lore book in the church, the one that's been translated, says that the current emperor, at least at the time that they left Hallowfall, was a man named Thoradin the Ninth. So there's at least, 8 other Thoradins that have ruled previously, aside from the original King Thoradin, who united Arathor to begin with. So we know, the names of, 13 emperors that have ruled, and I'm assuming that these are emperors that have ruled on the Arathi Continent, not kings that ruled after Thoradin stepped down on the Eastern Kingdoms. But as with many things in this lore, it is hugely unclear at best. Now, we're gonna go completely off the rails here, and I want to talk a little bit about movie canon, partially because I've seen people bring this up a lot when it comes to Anduin Lothar and Faerin Lothar, and I want to clear up that confusion. So, firstly, movie canon is not canon. It's not canon to the game, and probably never will be, though there have been things from the movie that were canonized. So in the movie, Anduin Lothar has both a wife and a kid, which he doesn't in game canon, though unfortunately both his wife and kid die. But in the movie, he also has a sister, Taria Ryn. She marries Lane Ryn, who fathers Varian Ryn, who fathers Anduin Ryn. So Anduin Lothar's sister is Anduin Ryn's grandmother. And again, this is not canon to the game. Though in-game his grandmother is Taria Ryn, it's just never said that she's related to Anduin Lothar in the game, so we can't assume that she is. But by movie canon, this would mean that Anduin Ryn is the last of Thoradin's descendants on the Eastern Kingdom side. That he would technically have claim to the Arathi Emperor. That he could become the Arathi Emperor. Now, this is never gonna happen in game canon, and part of that is because Anduin Lothar being the last of his line was a very important plot point in the Second War. But it's just sort of fun to think about, if we got a future storyline or something where when we go to the Arathi Continent that we have to rebel against the Emperor and that we get, Arathor 3.0 because Anduin steps up to take the throne and unites this Arathi Empire with Stormwind, but that's never gonna happen. And that's actually mostly because Anduin clearly has no interest in that whatsoever. But it tickles me. It's a really ironically fun thing to think about going through Hallowfall, and it would also mean that he'd be related to Faerin. But again, really distantly. The idea that he would also have Arathi blood and be related to all of these guys, but like I said, this is a huge stretch. This is basically just a headcanon, silly little AU fanfic at this point, because it all relates to movie canon. But I did want to bring that up because I'd seen some people making reference to Anduin Lothar's family in the movie when talking about Faerin Lothar, and it's not canon to the game, so don't take that as, evidence. As a fun little side note, the old Warcraft 2 manual refers to Anduin Ryn's great-grandfather, Barathin Ryn, as King Ryn III. I originally assumed this meant that he was Barathin III, but there's a line right after that in the manual that says, The constant bickering and infighting that marred the rules of former kings has no place in the court of Rin, which, while it may be a stretch, may imply that the court of Rin was a relatively recent development, especially if you take King Rin III to mean that he was the third Rin king ever, not necessarily that he was Barathin III. The reason I want to point this out is because we know that Stormwind was founded by the last of Thoradin's descendants 1200 years ago. That a man named Falder, presumably Lothar, ventured south to establish Stormwind, and I had wondered whatever happened to the Lothars that while they founded this city, didn't rule over it? And this could potentially be the answer to that. It could be that the Lothars, or that Thoradin's descendants, did in fact hold Stormwind's throne for some time before the House of Rin took over. Given the timeline, this would mean the Rins have been in power for anywhere from 150 to maybe a little over 200 years. And since Stormwind was founded 1200 years ago, that could potentially mean that the Lothars were on Stormwind's throne for 1,000 years, not accounting for any other potential infighting or coups or switches of power that may have happened in that time span. This is very tenuously canon at best, but it's fun food for thought, especially since we don't know any lore about early Stormwind or what happened to the Lothars that, despite founding Stormwind, the last one we ever knew of was simply a knight. And that is the complete and very detailed history of the Arathi. It's a lot to untangle, especially since we don't really know a lot about the timeline, nor do we know anything about the Arathi Continent. We learn very little throughout the course of Hallowfall questing. General Steelstrike does make one reference to how she put down a rebellion in one of the Empire's territories and was given accolades for it. And we know that the High Elf influence on their culture was decently strong, considering the role that lynxes play in their society. And I would venture to say also the fact that the Sacred Flame sort of holds a Sunwell-esque position of importance in their society. But we don't really know anything about the Arathi Continent or what has happened in the last however many years it's been since they broke off from our group of Arathi in the Eastern Kingdoms. Simply just that they've been there and had a very thriving empire, and that's about it. I don't expect us to see this empire anytime within the World Soul Saga, but I do hope that we go to it eventually, because talking about all of this gets me so excited for what we might end up learning. And I've speculated so much. I mean, it would be so cool to see, like, the rest of the Lothar family, to get a better look at how many there are, how they're related to the Emperor, perhaps anything else in the history about the Emperor, and also if we ever learn exactly when they left the Eastern Kingdoms. And on top of that, if there's any High Elves still alive on the Arathi Continent. I could truly keep talking about this forever. But I'm gonna stop it there before we get too into deranged nitty-gritty. So, thank you for letting me tell you all about the Arathi Empire, one of my most favorite parts of WoW lore. And I hope to see you in the next one.